So you use the term bud tender, which is great. If I'm a new bud tender and I don't know anything, like what is the sort of cannabis 101? Like what are you talking about in the first few days that goes beyond the just surface level consumer understanding of cannabis?
So I really like to approach kind of the fundamental elements of cannabis science, is what I call it, with new bud tenders. So really begin to impart a philosophy around how do we help guide patients and customers to cannabis that we think will work best for the therapeutic goals they've shared with us, and how do we do so in a respectful way, in a compliant way, in a way that actually allows us to form a connection with that customer, and in a way that helps us to better like comprehend it for the consumer,
Hmm.
basically. And that involves moving away from the Indica Sativa myth and moving into more of a deeper look at the compounds present in each batch, in each product, and being able to say, okay, there's X amount of THC, X amount of CBD, there's these three top terpenes that we're seeing. What kind of effect should that produce for most people, and really helping bud tenders understand that it's a prediction of experience, that this is actually all quite experimental, but it's really safe. Cannabis has very
Hmm.
low risk, but it's not something that is like an ibuprofen per se, where everybody will have a certain range of effects that are quite similar, and often limited in their diversity, where cannabis has a wide range of effects and they could be very different from person to person. And so it's all about one, training bud tenders to understand, okay, how do we get to the best prediction possible for experience when we're talking to a customer? And also, how do we make customers feel comfortable with the fact that they're going to have to experiment with themselves? And so, talking about strategies such as microdosing and certain helpful tips to make sure that you're in a situation where you feel comfortable consuming, and stuff like that.
What is the indica sativa myth?
So that is the general adoption of the vernacular around the cannabis species, cannabis indica and cannabis sativa, which even that species distinction is still quite debated by taxonomists, if they are two separate species, if there are more species, Afghanica, et cetera. For this example, we'll say that indica and sativa are generally regarded as species of cannabis.
Hmm.
And species, as defined by taxonomists, have a certain defining kind of morphological array of characteristics, whereas the cannabis community has taken those species, the terminology indica and sativa, and have co-opted them to mean a consistent effect. So indica means it'll be sleepy, sedative, it'll put you into couch, whereas sativa will be more uplifting and energizing. And I mean, the reason why this is flawed is, one, because we're taking something that has a definition of morphology, the way in which the plant grows, and then ascribing consistent effect to it in a plant that produces highly variable experiences dependent on the unique physiology of the consumer. So that's flawed. Second reason why it's flawed is because everything, or most everything at this point on the market, is made up of hybridized genetics, because especially through prohibition, we've just bred so many different varieties in so many different ways, and there was no real scientific log of that, since it was all done in the black market. And so most cultivars on the market have a mix of hybridized genetics. They have a mix of indica and sativa in them. And so it's really hard to say, okay, this is an indica and it will produce a sleepy experience in 99% of people. That's setting people up, in my opinion, for disappointment. And it's just not an expectation that has much scientific legitimacy behind it. So instead, I teach and advocate for moving beyond that myth that indica is going to be sleepy all the time and sativa is going to be energizing all the time. And instead, let's look at the compounds in a particular variety's batch, the cannabinoids and the terpenes most notably, to better be able to predict the experience that somebody's going to feel from consuming them.
Give me a specific example of, let's say, a consumer need or request, and like how you might prescribe for that. So pick an example. Someone has anxiety. That's me most of the time. How would I think about what to choose? It can be quite intimidating, right? Because of all these different options and strains and terpenes, like things like that you mentioned. Dumb it down for me as a consumer.
Sure. Yeah. I think that, one, don't be afraid to ask questions. to your bud tenders. And that also necessitates doing a bit of research on the dispensary that you're going to go to, where most likely the dispensaries will all stock very similar products. So you want to go to one that does have a certain reputation for having an educated staff, or at least a staff member that will take some time to really hear you out. I think that it is quite a collaborative relationship between bud tender and consumer, where, okay, in this kind of case study, if you come in with anxiety, one of my first leading questions would be, well, what type of experience are you looking for? So I know what you're not looking for. You don't want to feel anxious, but how do you want to feel? Or when do you want to consume? Or what are you consuming for? What are your goals here? And then I'll walk you through the different product options. Okay, do you want to smoke? Or are you not so comfortable with smoking? Maybe we choose an edible. We start with an edible that has a little bit more CBD with a little bit less THC. We discuss microdosing. Or maybe if you do like to smoke, if you do prefer that whole plant medicine and flower, then we can talk about terpenes, and we can talk about, again, choosing a mixed ratio of cannabinoids, keeping that THC fairly low so it doesn't spike anxiety, but then also pulling in a discussion of the bountiful and delicious terpenes such as limonene. And when I talk about terpenes, I really like to create analogies to the ways in which we consume terpenes every day, all day. I think it really helps make them seem like less of a foreign idea that they're only in cannabis, where terpenes are in almost every single plant. And if you've smelled a citrus fruit, you have consumed limonene. So that then allows me to build this bridge with the consumer of, okay, think about when you smell a citrus fruit, or think about even when you're cleaning your house, you have a sense of this like uplifted attitude, this certain euphoria that you get. And that's because limonene is actually interacting with our serotonin and dopamine receptors to make us feel a little bit more uplifted and a little bit less stressed and anxious. So I'll present a cultivar variety that has a higher concentration of limonene. I'm a big fan of kind of deli weight style, and in terms of the way that dispensaries sell flower, because it allows customers to smell the product, to see the product, to really interact with it. I know that because of COVID, that's not a thing right now, but when hopefully this is all over, we can resume that, because I think it's a really important part of the experience to, again, create that connection between the product and the consumer, to further push the understanding that this is something that's not so foreign. This is safe. This is a plant that has very low risk, and actually it contains compounds that, one, in terms of cannabinoids, our bodies already make very similar compounds as to that. We have a system, the ECS, that is primed to respond to those compounds. And then in regards to terpenes, we consume terpenes all the time. And so it again allows that building of trust, that certain alliance, not only between the bud tender and the customer, but also between the customer and the product.